everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for the latest in the crypto regs series, looking at how different lawmakers are regulating crypto. We're joined here by Philipp, one of the co-founders of Swarm Markets, and James from gunnercooke, who both bring huge amounts of experience looking at sort of crypto and DeFi regulation. And Philipp, I'll start with you first, if that's okay. You've got a regulated, one of the very rare regulated DeFi companies, and I know from speaking with you guys have looked at different regulators and ended up settling on BaFin in Germany. But how has your experience of the different regulators been, and what have your experiences been of how the different regulators around the world are looking at regulating crypto?
I mean, it's almost like a long answer to a very short question, right? Because you have to first of all ask the question when, because obviously the regulatory journey that we as an industry and we specifically Swarm have been undergoing is probably like 4 years old now, or maybe even 5. And starting off actually sort of dealing with American environments, US regulatory bodies. Then actually engaging a lot into different regulatory environments across Europe. Actually, this was around 2018 or end of 2017 and 18 that suddenly there was a strong signal coming from the fact that there was a lot of forward-leaning posture by regulators across Europe to positively look at how to bring sort of blockchain into the fold. And that involved like us engaging in different environments such as Liechtenstein and Switzerland and Luxembourg and the UK, as well as Jersey and all sorts of other ones that you'd sort of poke your head into, but then actually sort of depart again. So for us, the number one, it was a big surprise when a big credible regulatory environment like Germany came along and put some stakes in the ground and said, okay, we're gonna come out with a comprehensive view on the entire topic. But then secondly, also it was a question of our considerations. Because I mean, for us, it was a search to have the best combination of what is a credible environment that in future can allow you to scale in terms of credibility of what the license means, and then combined with a realistic path that whatever you do on the regulatory side has a realistic outcome, that it's not something that you just butting your head against the wall and trying to make it work, but it's something where there's a clear path that if you pursue it and the outcome is still a little risky, but there's a likely chance that you can actually succeed if you actually do that right. So in that case, sort of for us, that in the end actually became a very promising environment to actually engage in Germany.
Oh, thank you. And James, what have your experiences been as a lawyer with dealing with the different regulators?
I think it's neutral. I mean, at the end of the day, there's what you're trying to achieve and what the regulator is trying to achieve. And all regulators inherently want to do the right thing. The question is what does the right thing mean? And then you get different cultures off the back of that. So if you take Europe, the focus in Europe tends to be on the rights of the individual, and it tends to be on having a harmonized playing field. So if you speak to a German regulator or a German lawyer, they're going to talk about clarity, they're going to talk about being able to operate across multiple countries across Europe, and they're going to talk about the rights of consumers. If you were talking to a US lawyer, their philosophy is more about the rights of the corporate. So they're more into, less focus on rights of the individual, more about the company, how that should work and how it should move forwards. And if you're talking to China, it's about the rights of the state, because the fundamental belief is the state makes decisions on behalf of all the people. So you've got different philosophies coming in from different regulators, and then you've got the fact that those things change over time. So if you started off in the UK, crypto was seen as sort of quirky thing that strange people did, but no one really was involved in it. Low risk, do what you like. As it's entering into more mainstream, there's a fear that retail people who don't understand it will come in and there'll be issues, and therefore you're seeing a change in philosophy off the back of that. And then lastly, you've just got to look at what your business is actually doing, because different regulators are finding their niches. And again, if you're talking to someone like Gibraltar will tend to move first because it's a smaller jurisdiction. It can be nimble like that, and it thinks it will make money by being one of the first into an area. Other regulators might go slower because they see themselves having more to lose. So it's a question of looking at your business model, looking at the different regulators and their philosophies, and matching up your business model with the relevant regulator, and finding out which regulators is psychologically most in tune with what you're trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
And then bluntly, you've got the fact you want to live somewhere. And if the Antarctic Circle is the only jurisdiction which will satisfy your particular needs, shall we say, do you really want to live in the Arctic Circle for the rest of your life? So there is that kind of human element here as well.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, one of the main things one hears about regulation in the crypto and DeFi space is clarity coming from regulators and lack thereof. And the UK has sort of rather infamously not provided that clarity. And we've seen some companies leave the UK or move out of the UK to look elsewhere, whereas Gibraltar and Baffin in Germany, for example, have been some of the first regulators providing some of the clarity that is much called for. Is this the main thing that other regulators can learn from them, do you think, or what else can other regulators look to learn from these jurisdictions? Philipp?
So I think first of all, and maybe intentional or unintentional, I think that what happened in Germany end of 2019, then becoming effective as the amendment of the Banking Act beginning of 2020, it was effectively taking a very broad bracket around the definition of what a crypto asset is in different shapes and forms, from payment tokens to utility tokens to security tokens, etc. But predominantly, the underlying design element came in by saying these are mostly financial instruments, and by defining it that way in law, it defined actually anyone touching them, actually servicing them, and doing something as in that market actually then becomes someone who has to be licensed to do that, right? So it's a very simple way to sort of do something that has a wide-reaching effect. And a wide-reaching effect, if you look at it negatively, is obviously that a lot of the things that before became were doable, the very free form, became harder to do that way, and it imposed this process onto the industry with a grandfathering and a sort of a transition rule to then actually sort of bring them into the regulatory process, and then out of that into the license process. It's different than the approach that the FCA is taking, or it has been taking, by actually sort of doing something similar, but actually putting sort of companies into a sandbox and sort of trialing how that would work, and then observing that, and then at some point in time, in when comfort is big enough, to then actually sort of give a proper license to then play with the big boys. I certainly favor the first approach that sort of Baffin has been taking, because it gives us as entrepreneurs a way to cut our teeth in the real environment. It allows the regulator also to learn with that real environment and be able to sort of amend things along the way. And it's not only like creating this artificial lab environment that may or may not be what the reality actually looks like.
Yeah.
I mean, I think from my perspective, I love the phrase regulatory clarity, because to me it's a nonsense of two words put together. I mean, I've been asked by various regulators what they can do to improve the regulatory system. And what you get is you get a blank side of A4, you get a pen out, and then you don't know what to do next. At its core, I mean, there are laws in all countries. There is don't commit fraud, don't lie, don't steal. They all exist. So when you talk about regulation, what you're really talking about is you're talking about a regulator taking responsibility for your business. And therefore the question of whether do you want sort of clarity comes down to, that regulator's personality, what is it and how does it fit in with what you want to achieve? I mean, in Europe, effectively all they've done is they've taken MiFID, knocked off the edges and applied it to crypto, which is fine if you've got a business which is around which that suits. I don't think the law in the UK is unclear. I think it's very clear in most areas. There are one or two areas, yes, but that's the same with virtually every legal system on the planet. The key question we've got at the moment in the UK isn't so much a lack of clarity, it's a lack of speed, because most people want to be up and running in the UK with a sort of 3-month thing they thought they were going to get when the FCA registration regime came out it's not gone to that speed, and that's why people are upset. And the lack of clarity is then people trying to find ways not to have to register or to organize businesses not to have to comply with the rules. So it's not a question of a lack of clarity, it's a question of the fact that the speed isn't there, so people are finding other ways forward. But I do think, there's a blessing and a curse to every system. The blessing of the EU system is the harmonized framework, which means that once rules are set by one person, we move from one country to another. The blessing of not being in Europe is you don't have to comply with the rules of other countries. So again, it comes down to what is it that you're trying to achieve with your business. If what you are looking for is a product which is fairly, plain isn't the right word, but one which works in the existing legal framework and can be moved from country to country relatively easily, then that MiFID system works. If you're looking for something where you want to create something very bespoke and you want to change the rules, that does not work within a European system at all. And that's where something like the UK might find itself more suited foot. The other thing which is fascinating is we're seeing a huge change psychologically within regulators. As in the past, if you want to operate in a country, that was seen as a privilege, not a right. The regulator told you what they wanted to do, you went and did it, and that was the end of the relationship. What you've seen at the moment is a sort of two changed point. The first thing is regulators now in competition more with each other to attract companies into their countries. That was kind of started the FCA sandbox being taken up by other regulators. And it's now quite common for regulators to want to know what other regulators are doing and see if they can position themselves in a better way to move forwards. And the other thing you're getting groups of companies come together. So, you would have the European system where, the traditional passporting model. But in the UK, we've had memorandum of understanding between the FCA in Switzerland, the FCA South Korea, the FCA Australia, and all the rest of it. And whilst that isn't passporting by any means in the kind of the European sense, it is the beginning of a sort of skeletal framework which could one day go in that direction. So again, the question is where are your users? Where are your investors? Where does the story make sense for you exist? Because if you're going to sell to German people and you're getting money from French investors, then Europe's the obvious place to be. If you're going to sell into South Korea and Australia and the UK, then Europe becomes less relevant.
Cool, thank you. And what do you see as sort of next for I guess existing crypto security laws? I mean, is it a question of sort of bringing crypto assets and the ecosystem around that more in line with the existing security laws, or I think maybe more realistic as many in the crypto space would see it? Is it a question of the laws having to evolve and change as innovation happens, as new technologies come in, and as new things come across in the crypto and specifically DeFi space? A question of the law catching up with the innovation. I have a feeling we might all be in line on that viewpoint, but
yeah, I think James touched on a point that is absolutely correct. That first of all, there is clarity around what regulatory expectations are in different jurisdictions, which means if you hold true to those standards, it shouldn't matter whether you're dealing with a crypto assets or a non-crypto traditional asset in some ways, right? It's just another digitized form. Funny enough, actually, any kind of stock database, on a stock market is actually also a digitized form. It's just a centralized digitized form, right? So it doesn't really matter what the nature of that is. That said, I think there's obviously some edge cases where clarity actually matters a lot. So for example, what does a private key mean, and how do you verify the unique ownership of the private key, and how does that replicate itself onto custody situations? And then the whole next topic is then sort of taxation, etc. So who's actually the true owner and holder, and who holds responsibility for what that crypto assets it means and what it is. Those edge cases are, they're not significant for the foundational piece. They're significant for just making it workable and giving clarity and around sort of different edges of what that means. But I don't think that it's necessary to introduce a whole lot of new crypto regulation. As we've seen actually with Germany, actually the amendments were very minor. They were just basically sort of putting something in clarity into that, saying, okay, all these foundational principles still exist and they should hold true. And here's how we're defining that these crypto assets actually come into the same fold. So they didn't have to replicate and define new a whole lot of concepts, regulatory and legal concepts. So I think it's going to be an ongoing evolution. It's going to be a journey. But you can only actually experience that if you as a regulator actually engage with it and not hypothesize too much about it, but actually start to practice it.
So you'd see it almost more of a question of speed of engaging with the companies than providing more clarity that's needed.
Yeah, and it speaks a lot to the organizational capabilities of the regulators on the other side, right? So, a lot of the slowness of regulators comes from the fact that there's individuals missing on the other side or systems missing on the other side that is able to help the regulator understand really what's going on and interpret that, and then give guidance around it. So as regulators are trying to catch up, it is important that that we actually get that capacity in order to actually move quickly. Otherwise, it becomes a too high of a burden, and some regulators will then decide saying, okay, this is inconclusive for me, so I'm not going to give a guidance on it, which we've seen a lot in the US happen. Or it's going to be that saying, I don't understand this, that's why I'm just going to say no to something. Doesn't mean that it's right or wrong. It just means that the regulator is not clear on what that means, right? And so I think it is a key part just in terms of how the organization as a regulator is capable to absorb whatever that change means and how this innovation happens and unfolds in front of their eyes.
Yeah, I think from our side, I mean, I completely agree with the clarity point. There's 2 points I'd pick up. I mean, the first one, I always find it quite funny when people talk about regulators catching up with crypto. But I think there's some ways you can actually reverse it. I think there's certain things which happen within crypto assets and blockchain which are better and superior to the existing financial system. So for things like, AML checks and KYC checks, there are new solutions people are putting forwards around DeFi and that infrastructure, which actually have the same outcomes as the existing system and are slicker and quicker. So the question then becomes, should traditional markets and traditional securities actually have to come up to speed to be more in line with crypto more generally, because crypto has got a better solution to some of the problems which are being put forward? And I think, just also picking up on your point of clarity, I think the other big area of clarity is, to me, this difference between could and should, because at the moment there are lots of assumptions in the way that things are regulated. And to give you an example, one of my favorite examples, if you buy Bitcoin, there's an assumption you should do KYC and AML. No one tends to disagree with that. But the question then becomes, is how far should you go back? Because you can trace this back all the way back to the original Genesis block. And if you basically announce that first act of creating the first Bitcoin was an act of treason because it was creating a currency in competition with traditional fiat money, everything from that is therefore the process of crime. Every holder of Bitcoin is therefore committing a illegal act, and suddenly has to look up everyone who's ever held a Bitcoin. Now, I once asked the regulator whether they would be locking up every single Bitcoin holder, and they told me to naff off because it was a stupid question. But if you read the rules stringently, you can do it. And, it's the same as if I go and buy a sandwich from a sort of sandwich shop, I will use a £20 note to get the sandwich. 80% of £20 notes in the UK have traces of cocaine on them. We do not expect the sandwich shop to do a sort of spectrum analysis to see if my £20 note has ever been used in a drug deal. Same with crypto. How far are we expecting them to go back? And, there's a sort of assumption with a lot of crypto that we have to somehow be perfect, and we don't. We just have to be at least as good, if not better, than the existing system, because that is what we are comfortable with. And I think one of the best areas of clarity we can get is, we have a new technology, but do we actually think philosophically we should be imposing higher duties on people now just because we can? Or are we happy with what we've got, in which case maybe we're holding crypto and blockchain to too high a standard?
And by the way, you're touching on an excellent point. I think to the automation of some of these workflows, right? Actually, technology can, if verified correctly, technology can be superior. And if you look, for example, to liveliness tests, which traditionally have been done now with technology with video conferencing and live one-to-one communication, Well, if there's a 3D face scan and biometrics data that is matching up to it, you can actually do that at very low cost, highly automated, and you can do it almost on every transaction. So the confidence should be by definition much higher than if you just do that sporadically or at an onboarding event. And it becomes incredibly traceable and incredibly sort of secure. Second piece, and James touched on it, which I've experienced firsthand with regulators, is that, I always tried to tell them that it's basically not about catching up, but actually having a better, more fruitful environment for imposing today's standards and make that technology support it. And sometimes the eyes just, glaze over and say, why is that the case? But you have to realize if you actually do a stock purchase in the traditional markets, you go as a buyer to a brokerage, to then within a banking house to the centralized exchange that then communicates with within the order book with the same chain on the other side, and then to settle the whole deal, you then have to go to a central custodian. So you have at least 6, if not 7 different entities that you actually have to then impose regulatory expectation towards. And you have to keep track of it and reconcile it, and then you have to sort of settle it, the whole thing. And that obviously collapses on the blockchain because that's the instant settlement of one transaction, which should have all the clarity, counterparties, no counterparty risk, but kind of counterparties from an AML perspective cleared. It should actually know what it's doing right before you execute it. So there's a confidence in code of execution and settlement. And so even the simple thing that in the stock market obviously is standard every single day, where you do sort of borrowing and lending of securities, it is unclear today in the market actually who's really owning and holding and lending against what stock and what security, because these different systems actually don't reconcile in real time at the moment in time that you need that information. So actually regulators are recognizing this as an opportunity, and that we could come to a better system of today's financial markets, not even of any kind of crypto assets or cryptocurrencies.
Just of the future of finance.
Correct.
I mean, I think one of the best things I've heard about DeFi, long ago, was that DeFi really, it will soon just become seen as a new version of finance, and that the two are merging together. So I think that is being picked up on more and more, that it's not sort of two worlds that are totally apart. It's really how traditional finance and sort of some of the DeFi startups end up merging and working together.
Yeah, to me, so when you go back to the early 80s, we had the financial markets, the FIX protocol, which is basically a way to communicate the nature of a stock traded asset amongst different exchanges, but it's basically just a data exchange protocol, right? I think with what DeFi could present, and again, excluding everything that concerns crypto assets, you're actually sort of going to a programming platform that connects or becomes a connective tissue amongst banking institutions. So you actually create something that everyone can use, compose new products with, can actually introduce automated methods, and it somewhat changes the way that a bank understands itself, being sort of more customer driven, but it doesn't change the fact that banks exist. Yeah.
No, thank you. Well, just have you got a final point on what will make the most difference to the DeFi ecosystem coming from regulators? Have you any views on that?
I think from my perspective, it's a question of slowing down, in the sense, which I know is a weird thing to say, but people rush at DeFi. My favorite question about anyone who talks about DeFi to me is what do you mean by DeFi and what are you trying to achieve? And you tend to fall within two different boxes. Box A is someone who wants to get a better form of finance or a more robust form of finance or a slicker way of moving things around. That is a question then of that's creating something superior, it makes sense, you put it in, you think about it properly. The second group of people is you get the guy who announces, I want to sell derivatives in Bitcoin to 8-year-old boys over video games, but look, the law doesn't apply to me because I'm DeFi. That's the sort of thing where it sort of hits the buffers. You're seriously, you're going, this is never going to off the ground, and please, I never want to hear about this ever again. I think, therefore, the first question is not panicking, because people tend to go to DeFi and there's them of, we must reinvent everything from scratch because it's DeFi. That's not what you need to do. What you need to do is you need to work out what it is you're trying to achieve. you need to look sensible at what you're trying to get. I mean, one other one I love it is, the people who will turn up on stage and announce, we're a DeFi platform, we're nowhere, and I'm assisting again where you're up on that stage and I can see you, therefore you're clearly part of it. So that kind of killed that argument straight off by virtue of turning up. So I think the first question is working out what it is you're actually talking about. And then, lawyers are the most lazy people on the planet. You take the existing legal system, you copy and paste it, and then you work out where the problems are. See what I mean? That's where you're going to end up going. If you've got DeFi for a financial system, how does it stop the existing one? Where can we maximize the advantages? Not just worry about disadvantages, but where can we actually help it where we want to help it, and do a risk off the back of it.
So I 100% agree with everything you've said. I think the thing that people misunderstand about DeFi is that it's not about the fact that something is open and open source, but it's actually the key elements that make something very interesting is that there's self-custody, there's a transparency of what actually gets executed, and there's novel concepts of shared liquidity, I would say, right? And that applies to both exchange functionality as well as lending functionality. So there's some way that asset holders themselves can actually become market participants and makers of some kind to do something more with the assets, which I think is one of the most revolutionary things that actually sort of DeFi has shown, right? Now, in nowhere I said it has to be a DAO or it has to be something that is anonymous or in that sense. I think quite to the contrary. I think that there is a missing flavor, and this is obviously why we went down this route, that there's people on the sidelines, institutions, but also just individuals that are getting worried that if they do something within DeFi, it might actually impose negatively onto the assets that they hold, because the regulators are asking questions that they cannot answer. So where is this coming from, and what's the risk that you have in your asset base once I want to convert it back to fiat? So there is an AML consideration there. But more importantly, the risk that I take as a consumer of this infrastructure, it has a lot to do also with the risks of technology. So we're stacking all this complexity on top of each other. And in the end, it's about these different layers, right? You have to know the network layer and what it means, then the sort of the smart contract layer, then the sort of application layer, and then just the user interface in some ways. And each one of them can actually fail. And we've seen a lot of errors happen. We've seen a lot of nefarious activity happen. And that is not instilling a lot of confidence. Yeah. That said, we actually have players in the market, in the DeFi market, that have proven over 12 plus months time that they are in very good shape to control, to handle different volumes, very large volumes. And believe me, everyone's tried to get at those volumes, because then you can actually get a hold of those assets. So it's the most battle-proven setup that you can imagine it to be. So. But and all this DeFi mashing up actually boils down to 5 different core use cases. So I think we're now actually very clear what those use cases are, how they should function in different shapes and forms. And so now it's about the composability to then bring that into the fold and give some clarity to market participants to then extend the use case and the volume quite significantly.
No, amazing. Well, thank you guys so very much. Conscious of times and keeping things short and sweet, but no, I mean, you make a good point, Philipp, that it also comes down to the DeFi company and in question, and we've seen all sorts in every sense of the word. So yeah, thank you very much both, Philipp from Markets and James from gunnercooke. Thanks for joining us on the Crypto Reg series.